In the Middle Ages, duels were as commonplace as the tolling of bells at dawn, the aroma of freshly baked bread in a bustling market, or the lowing of cows in a pasture at dusk. It was not unusual to see two men, and on rare occasions women, facing off in a dusty clearing, a crowded plaza, or a dark alley, armed with swords, clubs, sickles, daggers, or whatever they had at hand, all to settle a dispute that could range from an insult shouted in a tavern to an accusation of treason echoing through the halls of a castle. But why were duels so common? What drove people to risk their lives in single combat in an era where surviving winter, a plague, a siege, or even a simple fever was already a feat worthy of bards? To answer this question, we must dive into the very heart of medieval society, a world where honor was more valuable than gold. Legal systems were rudimentary, warrior culture permeated every aspect of life, and religion dictated everything from sowing a field to wielding a sword. This is an extensive journey, filled with details, anecdotes, historical facts, and a touch of humor that, without overdoing it, will help us unravel why duels were such a deeply rooted practice in the Middle Ages. Picture medieval Europe, a period stretching from the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century to the dawn of the Renaissance in the 15th. It was hardly a haven of peace, but rather a chaotic mosaic of kingdoms, fiefs, counties, duchies, lordships, and later, city-states, each with its own laws, customs, alliances, and feuds. There was no centralized judicial system as we know it today. No police patrolling the villages, no courts with impartial judges, no offices where you could file a written complaint with an official stamp and a form in triplicate. In many places, the only authority was the feudal lord, who was not always available or interested in mediating his vassals' disputes. Often, the lord was busy waging war against a neighboring fief, hunting deer for a banquet, attending a tournament, negotiating a strategic marriage, or simply enjoying a jug of wine in his castle while a troubadour sang of his ancestors' deeds. In this organized chaos, duels emerged as a direct, practical, and, in many cases, the only way to resolve a conflict. If words failed, and in a society where pride was a currency more valuable than a sack of coins, words often failed spectacularly. Steel, a club, a sickle, or even a well-thrown rock were next in line. It wasn't just about fighting. It was a way to restore order in a world where order was as fragile as a parchment exposed to rain or a castle under siege. Honor was the fuel that powered this practice, the engine that drove the wheel of duels and, in many ways, medieval society itself. In the Middle Ages, honor was not a pretty word or an abstract ideal mentioned in Sunday sermons. It was the pillar that upheld social life, an asset as tangible as a plot of land, a flock of sheep, or a chest full of coins. Your reputation defined who you were. It determined your place in the community, your chances of securing a good marriage, closing a business deal, maintaining the loyalty of your allies, or even surviving in an environment where trust was a rare luxury and enemies lurked around every corner. An insult, however trivial it might seem, a misspoken word in a tavern, an accusation of cowardice, a hint of disloyalty, or even a glance interpreted as a challenge, was a direct stab at your identity. You couldn't simply shrug it off and go back to plowing your field, drinking your beer, or weaving your cloth. That would be unthinkable, a social suicide. An affront was an attack on your prestige, and failing to respond could mean ostracism, the loss of lands, the scorn of your peers, or even a violent end at the hands of rivals who smelled weakness like wolves in a forest. A duel, then, was far more than a fight. It was a public declaration that you were worthy of respect, a spectacle where you proved, before the eyes of all, from the feudal lord to the lowliest peasant peering curiously from a hay cart, that your name meant something. Losing a duel didn't just cost you blood or, in the worst case, your life. It could cost you everything. Your status, your family, your place in the world, your legacy. In a world where memory was short and reputation was everything, a duel was a way to carve your name in stone, or erase it forever. But duels weren't always about personal pride, a harsh word spoken in a moment of anger, or a defiant glance in a market. Many had a legal purpose, and this is where things get truly fascinating. In what was known as trial by combat, duels were an official tool of the judicial system, especially in the early centuries of the Middle Ages. before modern courts with judges, written codes, and legions of scribes began to take shape. The logic, though it may seem absurd today, was simple and deeply rooted in the mindset of the time. If two people couldn't resolve a dispute, say, over a contested inheritance, a disputed plot of land, an unpaid debt, an accusation of theft, treason, or even murder, they could bring their case before a lord, a bishop, or an improvised tribunal and opt for a duel. The belief was that God, in his infinite justice, would intervene to ensure the victor was in the right. Losing didn't just mean you were wrong. It implied that heaven itself had declared you guilty, a verdict that weighed as heavily on earth as in the afterlife. In an era where religion was the lens through which the world was interpreted, this idea was almost unquestionable. A lightning bolt in the sky, a bountiful harvest, a sudden illness, a victory in battle, or even a duel won were divine signs, and judicial duels fit perfectly into this worldview. If you lost an arm, had your head split open, or in the worst case, were sent to the other side, you hadn't just lost the fight. You'd lost God's favor, a message everyone understood, from the noble in his castle to the peasant in his hut. By the way, speaking of messages everyone should understand, make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. There, we break down topics like this with a touch of humor, fascinating facts, and stories that'll make you feel like you're strolling through a medieval castle, spying on a duel in a crowded plaza, or listening to a troubadour in a smoky, laughter-filled tavern. Back to duels. Trials by combat weren't exclusive to nobles, though they are often the most visible protagonists in chronicles and legends, with their gleaming armor, swords forged by master smiths, and warhorses snorting as if they knew they were center stage. In theory, any free person could participate in a judicial duel, though the rules varied by region, era, and social class. A noble could show up in full armor, helm, greaves, chainmail, the whole package, with a tempered steel longsword and a shield emblazoned with his coat of arms, looking like he'd stepped out of a tapestry or cathedral-stained glass. A peasant, on the other hand, might have to make do with a staff, a rusty dagger, an improvised spear made from a sharpened branch, or, at best, a woodcutter's axe that had seen better days. In some cases, if one party couldn't fight, for example, a woman, an elderly person, a sick individual, or a cleric, since monks weren't typically sword wielders, though some looked more like warriors than scribes, a champion could be hired. These champions were professional fighters, often mercenaries, low-ranking knights, or former soldiers who fought for a fee. They weren't exactly the romantic heroes of Arthurian legend, with flowing capes and pure hearts. Think of them as the medieval equivalent of a high-profile lawyer, but instead of eloquent speeches, they delivered precise blows with a mace, sword, or well-wielded club. Some champions were so renowned they had a reputation for being invincible, making hiring them like stacking the deck, if you could afford their services, that is. In a recorded case in 11th century France, a famous champion known as Gautier the Strong-Armed was hired by a widow to defend her inheritance rights against her brother-in-law. Gautier won the duel, but not before breaking 3 shields, dislocating his opponent's shoulder, and leaving the field with a leg wound that, according to the chronicler, made him limp for the rest of his days. The widow reclaimed her lands, Gautier pocketed a purse of coins, and the crowd, which had bet their last pennies, celebrated as if they'd won the medieval lottery. Not all duels were so formal or legally grounded. Many erupted spontaneously, fueled by the heat of the moment, an extra jug of beer, a spark of anger, or a misunderstanding that spiraled out of control. A tavern argument could escalate quickly if someone spilled, intentionally or not, a drink on another, if a sarcastic remark hit a nerve, or if a glance was interpreted as a challenge. In cities, where guilds and merchants began gaining influence from the 12th century onward, duels could also arise from commercial disputes. Picture 2 merchants facing off in the market square because one accused the other of selling shoddy wool, using rigged weights to cheat customers, or bad-mouthing their family to discredit them among fellow traders. These fights didn't always end in death, but they could leave scars, both physical and social, that marked the participants for life. In a documented case in 13th century Florence, 2 weavers clashed with daggers because one accused the other of copying his fabric design. The duel ended with a superficial cut on one's arm and a public apology from the other, but the rivalry between their families lasted generations, like a medieval version of the Capulets and Montagues, but with less poetry and more sewing needles. And while duels between women were rare, they weren't non-existent, adding a fascinating layer to this story. There are records of women facing off, particularly in family disputes, accusations of witchcraft, or conflicts over communal resources like wells, pastures, or market rights. In a documented 13th century case in Germany, 2 women fought with clubs over a dispute about a village well. The chronicler, with a touch of irony that echoes through the centuries, noted that the duel drew a larger crowd than a nightly tournament held the same week in a nearby town. The spectators, it seems, were captivated by the novelty of the spectacle, and bets were placed as fast as the well water in question. According to the account, one woman, nicknamed Maria the Strong, won with a particularly well-aimed blow that left her opponent on the ground, though both reportedly reconciled, or so the chronicler claims, perhaps adding a happy ending to keep his readers content. In another case, in 12th century France, a woman named Isabelle de Rouen was accused of poisoning a neighbor and, rather than hiring a champion, chose to fight herself with a staff, arguing that no man could defend her honor better than she could. Though she lost, her bravery earned her the community's respect, and the local lord, impressed, pardoned her of the accusation. These cases, though exceptional, show that women, despite being marginalized in many aspects of medieval society, could participate in duel culture, either directly or through champions, and their role was more complex than often thought. The warrior culture of the Middle Ages was another key factor that made duels so prevalent. From childhood, men, especially nobles, were trained in the art of combat as if wielding a sword were as natural as breathing. They learned to handle swords, spears, bows, maces, axes, and later crossbows with a dedication that today might seem obsessive. For a knight, fighting wasn't just a skill, it was a way of life, an essential part of his identity, as inseparable from him as his coat of arms or his horse. The chivalric ideal, which began to take clear shape in the 11th and 12th centuries, placed courage, loyalty, and martial prowess on a pedestal so high it seemed to touch the clouds. Being a knight meant being ready to defend your honor, your lord, your faith, and, in some cases, a lady's honor with a sword in hand, no matter the consequences. Refusing a duel was admitting you didn't measure up to that ideal, which could cost you not only your reputation but also your lord's favor, your courtly position, your lands, or even the loyalty of your vassals. A knight without honor was like a blacksmith without an anvil, a troubadour without a lute, a monk without prayers, or a castle without walls. Useless, vulnerable, and a target of mockery. In a 12th century tale, a French knight accused of cowardice for refusing a duel was forced to parade through his village wearing a straw hat and a cowbell around his neck, a humiliation that, according to the chronicler, was worse than death itself, for he lived to remember it every day. Duels among knights, especially the more formal ones, followed a protocol that might seem straight out of an epic novel, a Hollywood script, or a fevered troubadour's dream. It wasn't uncommon for a duel to begin with a formal challenge, often delivered in a wax-sealed letter adorned with the offended party's crest, as if it were an invitation to a deadly dance. In this letter, the offended detailed the affront, perhaps a derogatory comment at a banquet, an accusation of disloyalty, a hint of treason, or even a glance interpreted as a challenge, and proposed a place, time, and conditions for the combat. Seconds were chosen, a sort of medieval referee, whose role was to ensure everything followed the rules of honor, as if fighting with swords had a code of etiquette. These seconds could also attempt to mediate to avoid the fight, offering a peaceful solution that allowed both parties to save face and return home without blood on their tunics. However, in a society where pride was as fragile as Venetian glass and more valuable than a sacred relic, these mediations rarely succeeded. Once the challenge was accepted, the weapons and rules were agreed upon. Would it be a duel to first blood, where the first to bleed lost and could go home to nurse their wounds? Or to the death, where only one walked away, leaving the other as a reminder of the cost of offending the wrong man? Would full armor be allowed? Helms, greaves, chainmail, and all, or would the combatants fight with little more than a tunic for a more egalitarian fight? All this was negotiated with a seriousness that today might seem excessive but was as normal in the Middle Ages as signing a contract, pledging loyalty to a lord, or saying a prayer before bed. The weapons, by the way, were a fascinating chapter in themselves, a universe of steel, wood, and creativity that reflected both the combatants' wealth and the urgency of the moment. While long swords are the undisputed stars of medieval films, with their dramatic gleam and metallic clash, duels could involve a wide variety of weapons depending on the region, social class, context, and even the fighter's mood. Nobles typically used swords, spears, maces, axes, warhammers, or short swords designed for quick thrusts, often paired with a shield bearing their crest, which served not only as protection but also as a kind of calling card. I'm Sir Guillaume, and this shield with a rampant lion says you don't want to mess with me. In judicial duels, weapons were strictly regulated to ensure a fair fight, or so the theory went. For example, some cases required both combatants to use swords of the same weight and length, or banned throwing weapons like javelins, bows, or stones, because apparently hurling things wasn't honorable enough. But in spontaneous duels, creativity could take over, and the result was often as chaotic as it was picturesque. There are records of duels with clubs, daggers, sickles, rakes, blacksmith hammers, hoes, pitchforks, and even kitchen utensils, as if someone decided a cast-iron ladle was as good as a sword. In a particularly curious 12th century case in France, two peasants fought with farm tools, a sickle against a hoe, because one accused the other of stealing a sheep. The chronicler, with a hint of mockery that resonates across centuries, noted that the duel looked more like a chicken fight than an honorable combat, but added that both men fought with a ferocity that would have impressed any knight. The outcome: one ended with a cut arm, the other with a blow to the head, and the sheep, apparently, went on grazing peacefully in a nearby field, oblivious to the drama it had sparked. And if you want to dive deeper into this topic, I've linked a book in the description that explores it in greater detail. The lack of legal alternatives was another crucial factor that made duels so common. As mentioned earlier, modern judicial systems with courts, judges, lawyers, and detailed legal codes didn't exist in the Middle Ages, especially in its early centuries. Justice depended heavily on the local lord, who wasn't always impartial. If the lord had a favorite, was involved in the dispute, or simply didn't care, perhaps because he was busy planning a crusade, attending a banquet, or arguing with the local bishop over who should pay for church repairs, getting a fair trial was like expecting it to rain wine, a dragon to appear on the horizon, or a peasant to become king. Duels offered a direct, almost democratic solution in their brutality. You, me, an open field, some weapons, and may the best man win. Or, in the case of trials by combat, may the one God favors win. This mindset was so ingrained that even as legal systems began to develop, particularly in the 13th and 14th centuries with the rise of royal courts, written laws, notaries, and the first inklings of common law, duels persisted as a way to settle personal conflicts, especially those tied to honor. In England, for example, the common law developed under Henry II in the 12th century began to reduce reliance on trials by combat, but they didn't disappear entirely until the 15th century, and duels of honor continued to be common long after, especially among the Anglo-Norman nobility, who saw single combat as a way to prove their worth in a world where reputation was everything. Religion, though it may seem contradictory, also played a crucial role in the popularity of duels. The Middle Ages was a deeply religious era, where faith permeated every aspect of life, from sowing a field to choosing a king, from a child's birth to a dying man's last breath. Duels, especially judicial ones, were seen as a form of ordeal, a divine test in which God would intervene to ensure the just prevailed. The idea was that God wouldn't let an innocent person lose, though reality was less idealistic. A stronger, more skilled, younger, better trained, or simply luckier fighter usually won, regardless of who was right. The Church had an ambivalent relationship with duels, a tug-of-war between faith and violence that defined much of the era. On one hand, it condemned unnecessary violence, especially duels over frivolous matters like insults, personal grudges, a spilled jug of beer, or a debate over who had the better horse. At the Council of Lateran in 1215, for instance, the Church tried to ban trials by combat, arguing it was presumptuous to assume God would always intervene to decide the outcome, as if the Almighty didn't have better things to do than oversee every fight in a muddy field. But on the other hand, The religious mindset of the time made many see duels as a legitimate way to seek justice. If you were willing to risk your life, it must be because you trusted God was on your side, right? This contradiction reflects the complexity of a society trying to balance faith with violence, the Christian ideal of peace with the reality of a world where the sword often spoke louder than prayers. In a 13th century sermon, an English monk lamented that men prefer to trust in steel rather than God's word, though, ironically, the same monk admitted to attending a duel the previous week just to ensure the rules were followed. Hypocrisy, it seems, isn't a modern invention. As the Middle Ages progressed, duels began to evolve, taking on a more theatrical and structured character, as if someone decided fighting could be both an art and a spectacle. In the 13th and 14th centuries, with the rise of tournaments and justs, duels became more spectacular, almost like mass events designed to entertain as much as to settle disputes. Tournaments were like duels with a Hollywood budget. Massive events where knights competed not only for honor but for fame, wealth, prestige, and in some cases, the attention of a lady who, according to romances, watched from the stands with a handkerchief in hand and an expression of admiration, or boredom, depending on how long the tournament dragged on. Justs, in particular, were a more controlled form of duel, with strict rules, reinforced armor, and lances designed to break rather than kill. Though, let's be honest, a poorly aimed wooden lance could still crack ribs, dislocate shoulders, break necks, or, in extreme cases, send a knight straight to the afterlife. These events didn't just entertain crowds. They reinforced the idea that combat was a test of virtue, valor, and social status. A knight who excelled in a tournament could win not only a cash prize or a trophy, sometimes a jeweled sword, a horse, or a bag of gold, but also the respect of his peers, an invitation to the Lord's table, a promotion in the hierarchy, or even an advantageous marriage. In a famous 1278 tournament in Normandy, a young and unknown knight, Guillaume de Montauban, defeated several higher-ranking opponents, earning not only a purse of gold but also a marriage proposal from a local baron's daughter. The story, according to the chronicler, ended with Guillaume marrying and living reasonably happily, which, in medieval terms, probably meant he didn't die in the next tournament or get accused of treason. And speaking of stories worth telling, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. You'll find more content on the Middle Ages, from epic battles to curiosities that'll make you laugh and learn, all narrated with the enthusiasm of a troubadour and the precision of a scribe. Duels also left a deep mark on the literature and popular culture of the time, fueling the imaginations of nobles, peasants, and anyone gathered around a campfire to hear a good tale. Stories of knights facing off in single combat filled romances, chronicles, and troubadour songs, which traveled through castles, villages, and courts, singing of deeds often more fiction than fact but capturing the spirit of the age. Figures like King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, though mythologized, reflect this obsession with the duel as a test of virtue, courage, loyalty, and, in some cases, love. In these tales, a knight was nothing if he couldn't wield a sword, ride a horse, slay a dragon, rescue a lady, or emerge victorious from a challenge against a rival, a giant, or a mysterious black knight who, conveniently, always appeared at the perfect moment to cause trouble. These stories didn't just entertain. They reinforced the idea that dueling was an essential part of noble life, a rite of passage that separated true knights from pretenders, heroes from cowards. Troubadours, singing of impossible loves, heroic feats, and epic betrayals, couldn't resist including a good duel in their verses, often exaggerating details to delight their audience. In a 13th century poem, a Provençal troubadour describes a duel between two knights for a lady's love, with vivid details, swords gleaming like the sun, blood staining the grass, a victor kneeling before his beloved with a flower in hand, that make one suspect the troubadour was more interested in rhyme than truth. Yet these stories shaped the era's mindset, turning the duel into a symbol of everything a man, or in rare cases, a woman, aspired to be. Not all duels were so epic or worthy of a poem, of course. Many were messy, brutal, and frankly, unnecessary, born of trivial misunderstandings, an extra jug of beer, or a spark of anger no one bothered to extinguish. A misheard insult in a tavern, a misinterpreted glance in a market, a dispute over a few coins, an argument about who had the right to cross a bridge first, or even a fight over who'd hunted a rabbit in the Lord's forest could quickly escalate into a duel. And while nobles had their rituals, gleaming armor, master-forged swords, and seconds acting as judges, duels among peasants, artisans, or common citizens were often more improvised and, at times, deadlier. Without access to quality weapons, armor, or formal training, a duel between two villagers could end with a well-placed club to the head. An infected wound that, in an era without antibiotics or modern doctors, was a death sentence, or a corpse no one bothered to bury with honors. In a recorded 13th century case in England, two men fought with hoes because one accused the other of moving a stone marking their land's boundary. The duel ended with one man on the ground with a broken arm and the other in serious trouble with the local lord, who wasn't thrilled about losing two workers over a stone that, according to the chronicler, wasn't worth the dung around it. Yet for those involved, that stone was a matter of honor, survival, and identity, and they were willing to risk everything for it. As legal systems developed, especially in the later Middle Ages, judicial duels began to lose ground. Royal and ecclesiastical courts started relying more on evidence, testimony, written documents, and, in some cases, juries, moving away from the idea that God would decide a fight's outcome with a verdict as clear as a lightning bolt. In England, for example, the common law under Henry II in the 12th century and reforms in the 13th and 14th centuries reduced reliance on trials by combat, though they didn't disappear entirely until the 15th century. In France, the Capetian royal courts also began prioritizing written laws and formal procedures, though duels of honor remained common among the nobility, fueled by chivalric culture and romances glorifying single combat. However, duels of honor not only survived but evolved into more sophisticated forms. In the Renaissance, fencing duels with elaborate rules, light swords, choreographed moves, and flowing capes took over, turning the practice into something more like a deadly dance than a street brawl. Even today, we see echoes of this mindset in things as varied as social media spats, where words are the new swords and likes are the crowd's applause, or in combat sports like boxing, modern fencing, or mixed martial arts, where physical prowess remains a test of valor, skill, and, in a way, honor. And if you want to learn more, check out the book linked in the description for a deeper dive. Duels also reflected the social tensions of the era, like a mirror showing the cracks in a deeply hierarchical society. In a world where power was concentrated in the hands of a few, kings, nobles, bishops, and later, wealthy merchants, duels were a way to challenge or reinforce those hierarchies. A lower-ranking knight could challenge a higher-ranking one to gain prestige, though, of course, he risked far more than his pride. If he lost, he could be ridiculed, lose his lands, his title, or worst case, end up with a sword through his chest, a reminder that challenging the powerful came at a cost. On the other hand, duels between equals could maintain the status quo, ensuring no one stepped out of line without paying a price, whether in blood, coins, or humiliation. In cities, duels among merchants, artisans, or guild members also served to establish who had the final word in a market, guild, or community. In 14th century Italian cities like Venice, Florence, or Genoa, where guilds were as powerful as nobles, it wasn't uncommon for two artisans to settle a professional dispute with a fight in a plaza, under the gaze of colleagues, clients, and sometimes local authorities, who often preferred to let fists, or daggers, speak rather than intervene directly. In a 1320 case in Genoa, two goldsmiths fought with knives because one accused the other of selling low-quality gold jewelry. The duel ended with a superficial cut on one's arm and a fine for both, but, according to the chronicler, the plaza had never been so full of onlookers. Another fascinating aspect was the spectacle surrounding duels, especially the more formal ones. They weren't just fights, they were social events, public dramas that drew crowds eager to see how the dispute would unfold, like a play with swords instead of dialogue. Noble duels, in particular, could gather an entire town, from other knights and courtly ladies in velvet gowns and glittering jewels to curious peasants who left their fields, plows, or looms to catch the show, often climbing onto carts or trees for a better view. Bets were sometimes placed on the outcome, with coins changing hands faster than blows, while peddlers seized the chance to sell bread, beer, or apples to the crowd. Clerics were often present, praying for the soul of the one likely to die, though some, with a resigned sigh, simply watched, knowing they couldn't stop the inevitable. In some cases, duels were held in public squares, designated fields, castle courtyards, or even city bridges, with an atmosphere reminiscent of tournaments but with a more personal, often deadlier edge. Spectators didn't just come for blood. They came to witness a story of honor, justice, vengeance, or, in some cases, sheer stubbornness unfold before their eyes like a play with very real consequences. In a famous 1280 duel in Castile, two knights faced off over an accusation of treason during a military campaign. The fight, held before King Alfonso X, drew hundreds of spectators, including nobles, clerics, merchants, and even a group of monks who, according to the chronicler, prayed for both but bet on the younger one. The victor, a knight of just 22, was hailed as a hero, while the loser was buried quietly, with a note in the chronicle saying, "May God have mercy on his soul, for men had none." Of course, not everything was so glamorous or worthy of a chronicle, poem, or tapestry. Duels could be brutal, especially among the lower classes, where there were no gleaming armors, master-forged swords, or clear rules. A poorly aimed blow with a club, sickle, or improvised stick could mean a fracture, an infection, or death in an era where medicine consisted of little more than herbs, prayers, bloodletting, and a good dose of luck. And while judicial duels promised divine justice, with God as the ultimate arbiter, the reality was that the better fighter, or the luckier one, with better armor or a stronger arm, usually won, regardless of who was right. This led to criticism, even in the Middle Ages itself. Some chroniclers noted, with a touch of cynicism that echoes through the centuries, that duels favored the strong, the young, or the wealthy who could afford a champion, not necessarily the just. Others, particularly clerics, argued it was a barbaric practice that contradicted Christian ideals of peace, forgiveness, humility, and love for one's neighbor. In a 13th century sermon, a French monk exclaimed that the man who trusts in the sword over God is doomed to the vanity of his own pride. Though, curiously, the same monk admitted in a later letter to attending a duel to ensure the combatants followed Christian rules. Yet these criticisms, however eloquent, weren't enough to stop the practice, which remained popular well into the late medieval period. A reminder that, in the Middle Ages, the sword often had the final word. To better understand the scope of duels, it's worth exploring how they varied by region, as the Middle Ages wasn't a cultural monolith but a tapestry of traditions, laws, and customs that differed from one kingdom to another. In Germanic kingdoms, for example, judicial duels were deeply ingrained, especially in the 8th and 9th centuries, when Saxon, Frankish, and Lombard laws, like the Code of Rothari or Charlemagne's Capitularies, included specific provisions for trials by combat. These laws detailed everything from permitted weapons, swords and shields, no bows or javelins, to the role of witnesses, pre-combat rituals, and consequences for the loser, which could include loss of lands, exile, or, in extreme cases, execution. In England, judicial duels were common until the 13th century, when the development of common law under Henry II and his successors began to replace them with jury trials, testimony, and written documents, though duels of honor persisted, especially among the Anglo-Norman nobility, who saw single combat as a way to prove their worth in a world where reputation was more valuable than a castle. In France, duels of honor among knights were more frequent, fueled by chivalric culture and romances glorifying single combat as a test of virtue, courage, and, in some cases, love. In Italian cities like Venice, Florence, or Genoa, duels could have a more urban character, with merchants, artisans, and guild members clashing in public squares over economic, professional, or family disputes. In the Iberian Peninsula, duels reflected a mix of Christian, Muslim, and Jewish influences, with an emphasis on skill with short weapons like daggers and rapiers, especially in reconquered cities during the Reconquista, where cultural coexistence added another layer of complexity to disputes. Weapons also varied by region, social class, duel context, and, in some cases, resource availability. In Northern Europe, long swords, spears, and shields were favorites, especially among nobles who could afford weapons forged by master smiths and armor costing more than an entire village. In the south, like the Iberian Peninsula, southern Italy, or Mediterranean cities, daggers and short swords were more common in urban duels, where tight spaces in alleys, plazas, or markets made long weapons less practical. In judicial duels, weapons were often standardized for fairness. Say, swords of the same weight and length, or wooden clubs for non-nobles. But in spontaneous fights, anything could serve as a weapon. There are records of duels with axes, clubs, blacksmith hammers, sickles, rakes, pitchforks, hoes, and even stones, as if combatants decided anything they could lift was fair game. In a particularly curious 13th century case in Castile, two men fought with sticks because one accused the other of stealing a mule. The duello ended with both exhausted, one with a black eye and the other with a bruised arm, while the mule, according to the chronicler, went on grazing peacefully in a nearby field, oblivious to the men's drama. In another case in northern Italy in 1290, two bakers fought with rolling pins because one accused the other of selling bread with less flour than promised. The duel, held in the local market, ended with both covered in flour and an agreement to share the recipe, though the chronicler doesn't say if the bread improved afterward. The role of duels in shaping masculine identity also deserves attention. As in the Middle Ages, masculinity was closely tied to the ability to fight, defend honor, and impose oneself in a world where physical strength was a currency as valuable as gold or land. A man who couldn't, or wouldn't, fight was seen as weak, and weakness was a luxury few could afford in an environment where enemies, whether bandits, rivals, or ambitious neighbors, were always lurking. This was especially true among nobles, where martial prowess was a core part of identity. A knight who refused a duel didn't just lose his peers' respect. He could lose his place in the social hierarchy, his lord's favor, his title, his lands, or even his life if his enemies exploited his apparent cowardice. But this mindset wasn't limited to the nobility. Even among the lower classes, duels were a way to assert manhood, to prove that, though you lacked a castle, a crest, or a horse, you were someone worthy of respect. In a 13th century case in northern Italy, a shoemaker defeated a butcher in a duel over a debt, and while he didn't gain riches, he earned the nickname the Brave Shoemaker, which, according to the chronicler, followed him to his grave, and his children carried it with pride. Women, though rarely participating in duels, weren't entirely excluded, and their stories add a fascinating layer to this phenomenon. Beyond the German case mentioned earlier, there are records of duels between women in France, England, Italy, and the Iberian Peninsula, often tied to domestic disputes, accusations of witchcraft, conflicts over communal resources like wells, pastures, or market rights, or even personal honor. In some cases, women hired champions to fight on their behalf, especially in judicial duels, where rules allowed a representative to defend the cause of someone unable to fight. In a famous 12th century case in France, a woman named Marguerite de Blois hired a champion to defend her inheritance rights against her brother-in-law, who accused her of forging a will. The champion won, but not without taking a blow that left him limping for life. Marguerite, according to the chronicler, celebrated with a banquet that cost more than the inheritance itself, proving that even in the Middle Ages, ostentation wasn't exclusive to men. In another case, in 13th century England, a woman named Agnes de York fought herself in a judicial duel with a staff, defending her right to a local market against a merchant who accused her of selling spoiled fish. Though she lost, her courage earned her the community's respect, and the local lord, impressed, let her continue trading tax-free for a year. These rare cases show that women, though marginalized in many aspects of medieval society, could engage in duel culture, directly or through champions, and their role was more complex and active than often assumed. In summary, duels were common in the Middle Ages because they were far more than fights. They were an expression of identity, justice, faith, masculinity, and, in some cases, sheer stubbornness in a society living on the edge of the sword. In a world where honor was the most valuable currency, a duel was how you paid your debts, or collected them. Though today they may seem barbaric, in their context, duels were a logical, practical, and sometimes the only solution to the problems of an era without universal laws, modern institutions, or, in many cases, common sense. The next time you watch a movie about knights, with their gleaming armor, swords clashing under the sun, and capes billowing in the wind, remember, behind every sword stroke was a story of pride, faith, justice, vengeance, and sometimes a simple stolen chicken that sparked a drama worthy of an epic.